So I'm here to talk to you about how to scale your startup DNA. How to keep your DNA as you're scaling your company. So a little bit about me and a bit of my story. My name is Bijal Nagrashna. I'm the Startup Business Development Manager for the Nordic and Baltic countries. I'm actually based in Sweden, so I'm very happy to be here, away from the snow, so thank you for having me. In my story, I went to engineering school. I didn't study engineering, but we all had to learn to code. I then joined a consulting company working in emerging markets. Then I joined an M&A firm and an asset management firm. And along my journey, I always introduced technology into the company, but it was quite slow to adapt. And I can understand if you're working for an asset management firm, you're hiring a portfolio manager who has a repeatable model that's of success, and innovation and change may not go hand in hand. So I left, and I wanted to be in an environment that was a bit more nimble, more agile, where we can try and experiment new things as well. So what I did is I joined a startup. It was a language learning application. I also started my own consulting practice where I helped startups on the business side, a lot of developers, go through their business models, financial models, work with investors, bring in their first customers. And I also co-founded one of my own companies as well, where I bridged the gap with the corporations and also the startup community. So that's my background. And along the way, when I was doing startups, you may know it's up and down. Sometimes you're on top of the mountain. Sometimes you want to crawl under your bed and not come out. And it was exhausting. And during that time, I was being recruited by Amazon. And I didn't want to work at the company. It's a very big company. I had a friend from uni that was working on this program in the US, and they wanted to scale it out into Europe. And she said, just come and interview. If you don't like it, that's fine. So I went, I interviewed, and I really loved the company. I liked that it was a very big company. We had resources in finance, accounting, HR, but the teams were small enough for me to work like I did as a startup, very scrappy, try things out, experiment. And I didn't know that a big company could be like that. So it's part of our DNA and part of what I'll talk about later on as well. So I was just going to do 1 year at the company and then do my own startups. I got tricked into staying 4 more years, so I'm still here. And the main reason why I'm still here is because of the culture that we have in the company. So I'll be here the rest of the day. If you have any questions, you can email me as well. So are any of you familiar with the Dunbar number? Or it's called the rule of 150. It's basically a number where an individual can have 150 meaningful connections and relationships with someone. And beyond that, you need to create rules and mechanisms in order to do that. So I'm here to talk to you about how you take your company from a 4-person, 10-person team to beyond the 150. So some of you may know Steve Blank. He's the father of Lean Startup, and he discusses the customer development process. And a lot of entrepreneurs, they stick to the beginning phase, which is the search phase. It's customer discovery and customer validation. And you have an idea, you go test it out, you either pivot or you iterate, and you do that cycle over and over again. But little time is focused on the execution phase, which is customer creation and also company building. And company building is very important. When Steve Blank talks about company building, he talks about it as a Shakespearean tragedy, meaning that as an entrepreneur, you've worked many years, blood, sweat, and tears into creating this company. And anything can happen. It could all fall apart. You may not have the best investors. The co-founders are not agreeing on the strategy. Your engineering team is not working cohesively. So what made your company successful at a team of 2 or 4 may not be the same skills that you will need to go to the next phase. But we've seen a lot of companies that have been successful in our startup ecosystem. So we have Brian Chesky at Airbnb. We have Box, Aaron Levy, who took the company and IPO'd a few years ago. And obviously, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos at Amazon. He was actually packing books on his hands and knees and taking it to the post office himself. And now he has a company of over 600,000 people globally. So we'll talk about how these companies were able to scale from a 2-person team all the way to the companies that they are now. And they were able to do it by successfully transitioning the company into the next phase through constant and rapid execution. One of the case studies that I will talk about is Airbnb. They're one of our AWS customers, and they are very open about their culture and how it's instilled into their company. So when they closed their Series C funding from Peter Thiel, who's the co-founder of PayPal, Brian Chesky invited Peter to a meeting to discuss the strategy and go deep into their data and to their metrics. And Brian asked Peter one question: what is the single most important piece of advice that you have for us? And Peter told him, don't mess up the culture. And it got Brian thinking about culture, and he penned this very famous blog post that you can Google, and he talks about how Airbnb handles their culture. In that blog post, he says about their culture that the culture is what creates the foundation for all future innovation. If you break the culture, you break the machine that creates your product. And Evernote has something similar to say about that as well. The product is the product, the culture is the next 100 products that you create. So let's dive deep in Airbnb. How are they structured? What is their culture about? So they actually have very tight groups of about 10 people or less, and they work cross-functionally. They work with engineers, with product managers, with designers, data scientists, and etc. And each team owns a non-overlapping piece of the project, but they're encouraged to collaborate. They also have separate teams, the host and the guests, because the needs are different for both of them. But they do have a symbiotic relationship, which is what makes Airbnb work, the interaction with the guests and the hosts. So they're able to collaborate together within these two separate teams, and they partner up on product roadmaps, on goals, on projects that they may have, so they can collaborate in a more structured manner. And the way they define the structure is, they call it structured teams with fluid responsibilities. So what is your startup DNA in your company? How do you build and keep the culture as you hire and scale your business? A lot of companies start off very agile. They can move very quickly and deliver innovation at a very fast rate. But then you become big, bureaucracy is involved, and you're slowed down. So when is it important for you to think about culture? You should start right now in your company. So the first few hires helps the company create an environment in which they want to work in, and they also help drive development. They're also the ones that are going to make decisions during interviews and also all the future hires as well. So if you have a few mediocre or not motivated employees at the very beginning, that could spell out doom before you even have launched your product. So it's very important to hire the right people. Airbnb actually defined their core value before they started hiring at scale. And in fact, Brian Chesky said it on the first 300 hires at Airbnb to make sure that the DNA was instilled in them, because he knew that they would make decisions on hiring later on, and also decisions on the product roadmap of the future. So you should start now. So the biggest challenge is finding people and finding the right people. So part of what I do with my role with startups is I also mentor them at incubators and accelerators. So we may go through things such as the investor pitch deck. It's quite important to raise funding if you're looking to do that. How do you illustrate your company to an investor? What is important to them? Startups will create a customer pitch deck. What is the value proposition of your product or your service to your customers and your potential customers? But very little time is spent on the actual employee pitch deck. You need to show to someone why they should work for you, why they want to work for you. What is your DNA? What are your values? And Jeff Bezos actually has something to say about that.
You attract people who have the DNA of pioneers, the DNA of explorers. You build a company of like-minded people who want to invent. And that's what they think about when they get up in the morning. How are we going to work backwards from customers and build a great service or a great product?
So keep your company vision and value crystal clear. To attract the right people, how are you going to clearly articulate your value? So Glassdoor did a study a few years ago. They said that when employers spend time in their employer brand book, they're 3 times as likely to hire the right people. So what happens when you're scaling your company and you're going at the next stage? How do you turn your culture into a place where people want to be successful and can be successful? So the VP of Engineering, Mike Curtis at Airbnb, says this: good culture creates an environment where people can do their best work. So what should you think about? As an early stage company, identify what your values are and clearly define that, who you are. But at the next phase, you should build a structure in that culture with your organization and put in place mechanisms to enable an environment for people to be successful. So the next example I'd like to talk to you about is Spotify. So if you Google Spotify, if you Google Spotify engineering culture, you'll find two really cool videos that explains how they work on the engineering team. And the first video starts off as, we don't even see culture. It's in the air, we live it and we breathe it. So it's very powerful. So how they are organized, and they have autonomous squads of about 8 people or less, so similar to Airbnb, 10 people or less. And each squad is responsible for their own piece of the product from the beginning to the very end. And the squads figure out how to build it, what to build, and also who to build it with as well. So they have a lot of autonomy. And the best way to show that is they drew out this Dilbert-like cartoon about alignment and autonomy. And they say that when you have low alignment and low autonomy, that induces micromanagement, and that's not really fun. If you have high alignment and low autonomy, you define the problem and you're also being told what to do and how to do it. That's not very creative or very innovative. If you have low alignment and high autonomy, you have no clear sense of direction, so your engineering team may be all over the place doing who knows what. So what they strive to do is to be in that top quadrant over there, is to have high alignment and high autonomy. So they figure out the challenge, but they have autonomy to figure out how to solve that challenge and what to actually do about it. So they're basically structured in their community. And I forgot to mention before, their teams are referred to as loosely coupled, but tightly aligned. Another company, any of you know Supercell? It's a Finnish company. They're a gaming company. They've made Clash of Clans. Interesting fact about them, they have 200 people, 4 games, and $2 billion in revenue. So they're doing all of that with a very small team. And how they're structured is each of the games have their own team, and they have a management team, but the management team acts as a resource to the rest of the team. So it's not the other way around, as in most of the other companies. And what's really cool about them is that the games team makes all the decision on the direction of the game design. And what's interesting about them as well is they celebrate failures in a very big way. They actually throw champagne parties when they've messed up. And they've named some of their conference rooms after failed games as well. And they take all of these findings and incorporate into the next production. So what happens next? The grow-up phase. So you're scaling beyond the size of Supercell and Airbnb and Spotify. So as scaling, it's a different story. We've been around for 20 plus years, and we consider ourselves a tech company still. And what is it that brings us together? What is our culture? So it's basically our Amazon leadership principles, and Cheyenne may have mentioned some of those earlier in the day. If I go to the Tokyo office, if I go to the Swedish office, California, I'm going to Cape Town next week. These leadership principles are splattered on the wall, whether it's in the kitchen area or the entrance. We live it and we breathe it. And the leadership principles are authentic, and they represent what the company really is. And we use them as a practical reference when we want to prioritize something, when we're creating strategy, or when we're hiring as well. And going back to what I talked about not wanting to work at Amazon and for a big company, I thought, when I interview, they told me to make sure I know my leadership principles, and I thought it's just going to be a week thing. But no, I use it every day in my vocabulary. When I mentioned before, I'm going to dive deep into some of the examples that Cheyenne had. I use it when I build my strategy. I use it when I interview people as well. So it's a common vocabulary that we use within the company. And we're actually actively encouraged to disagree and commit with anyone, even senior leaders. We're encouraged to dive deep into data and to be vocally self-critical of what we're doing, and to own a piece of the project from beginning to end as well. And this brings me to diving deep into our first leadership principle, which is ownership. And the textbook definition of that is leaders are owners. They think long-term, don't sacrifice long-term value for short-term results. They act on behalf of the entire company beyond just their own team. They never say, that's not my job. And the way we define leaders at Amazon, it's not the leaders, it's everyone in the company. We define everyone as a leader. And you can be a leader in your domain. So since I work in the Nordics, I'm seen as a leader in the startup community within the domain of startups for my specific market. And this really drives the way we operate as well. We mentioned earlier the DevOps methodology that we have in terms of working together. So that term is being used a lot now. We were actually using it back in the early 2000s. It's the way we structure our organization in order to drive ownership. So going back to the leadership principles. We have small teams that are cross-functional and they own everything from beginning to end as well. So we don't just write a line of code and send it off to someone else. We don't create a service and then send it to marketing. We own everything from beginning to end. And how we do this is the 2-pizza team. If your team is too big and you need more than 2 pizzas, then we reorganize and we make the team smaller. And who do we have in the 2-pizza teams? Well, we hire and develop the best people. The definition of this: leaders raise the performance bar with every hire and promotion. They recognize exceptional talent and willingly move them through the organization. So we have an entire process of how we actually hire people, which I'll go into details, and also how we develop people within the company. One of the things that we're constantly looking to do is that we're constantly hiring, and we're hiring the best people. And we want these people to raise the bar. So we created this program called the Bar Raising Program back in 1997. And this is a person that goes through extensive training to make sure that whoever comes into the company is better than most of the people in the company. And during the interview process, they'll also interview the candidate. And this person will not be in your direct team. They'll be in another team so they can have a third point of view, like an objective point of view. And some of the things that this bar raiser looks for when we're hiring is, are they better than 50% of the current team? Are they raising the bar? The other thing that they look for is long-term impact. Will they have long-term impact on the business and our customers? Can they move to a completely different business unit and still be successful? So you heard my colleagues Cheyenne and Henry speak earlier. They were hired after me, so technically they can claim that they're better than me. I don't think so, but just joking. So that's basically the role of the bar raiser. So when should you think about having this mechanism of hiring? Well, you should think about it right now before you start scaling, because when you're a founder and you're hiring the first few people, you're gonna have to go on and do something else. So build this mechanism now. And I'll go over our mechanism and how we are prepared and how we are interviewing at scale. So first thing that we do is we figure out competency. So if you're coming as a software developer, we try to make sure you actually are a software developer and you can actually do the job. So that's the first phone screen. And then if you pass that, it's the second phone screen. Writing is very important at Amazon as well. We talked about the PR FAQ process, working backwards, and I'll dive deep into that in a little bit as well. We don't use PowerPoint slides at Amazon. We just do it when we do presentations like this, but internally everything is written. So you write a strategy document. It's from 1 page to 6 pages, no more than 6 pages. So we get a writing sample from the candidates to see if they're able to write and articulate an idea. After that, once you have passed it, you have 6 interviews. It says 5 here, but the 6th one is the bar raiser that I mentioned earlier. So when I was interviewing, 90% of my questions were behavioral, and they were based off the leadership principles. So each person that will interview you in this 6 interviews is called a loop, so you're invited to the home office. And one interview may test you on customer obsession or earn trust. Another interview may test you on our leadership principles, a bias for action, or invent and simplify. So an example of this question could be, tell me about a time where you had a complex problem and you found a simple solution, and why did you think it was complex? So I would ask that question to someone if I'm testing for invent and simplify, and usually we try to use a STAR method to tease the information out of them. And we question them a lot, not to prove them wrong, but to get to the very deep meaning of what they're trying to say. And a lot of times we ask them not to say we, say I. I would like to know what you have owned, what impact have you created? And what happens after that is we get together, we write the feedback into our portal, and we have a debrief. It's about 30 minutes to an hour. And we talk together about the candidate and show concerns, or we can talk about, there was great strength in customer obsession, but there was concerns in invent and simplify. And someone else could say, well, we talked about bias for action, and this candidate actually gave a great example of always also inventing and simplifying. So we have a debate to see whether we're going to hire the candidate or not. So if we hire them, then obviously that's a go. If you don't hire them, we have a small process around that too. So maybe they did very well on all of the leadership principles, but they maybe are not a fit for this specific role. So what would happen then is we would recycle that resume and they would go back into the pool. They can apply for another position, or we can approach them for another position on the team. And if we see and if we agree that this candidate did not exemplify anything in our culture and none of our leadership principles, then we don't recycle it. So the next leadership principle that I'd like to share with you is diving deep. So leaders operate at all levels. They stay connected to details and audit. So all the leaders are not only encouraged to have a 50,000 meter view of an issue or a challenge, but we also have to roll up our sleeves and go down into the details. And the way we do this at Amazon is we're very we're very data driven when it comes to our methodology. So a lot of the teams will have weekly metrics meetings, and each of the 2 pizza teams that I talked to you about will have their own scoreboards, and they'll have metrics on data that is impactful to their customer subset. And they'll take a look at this data on a weekly basis and find anomalies. Maybe it's the positive anomalies, and we try to dive deep and see what actually worked. If it worked, can we scale it out to different business units or different markets? If we see something that didn't work in the data, then we try to be proactive and be preventative. An example that I can share with you on where we saw data and something went wrong is that we have a product called Amazon Instant Video. And a few years ago, we had a glitch during the playback. So you started watching a movie and all of a sudden it would freeze and it would start over again. So you never really finished the movie. So someone on the team saw this in the data and they dove deep into the data and saw what the issue was. So what they did is they proactively sent an email to all of the customers that were impacted and said, we're sorry that you had a bad experience. We're going to refund you $3.99. So this was a way for us to dive deep, which is part of our DNA, but also be customer obsessed and delight the customers by proactively going to them without getting any complaints and also refunding their money back. This leads to our most important leadership principles, which is customer obsession. Leaders start with the customer and work backwards. They work vigorously to earn and keep customer trust. Although leaders pay attention to competitors, they obsessed over customers. And as Shine mentioned earlier, Jeff Bezos, when he created Amazon, he set out for the company to be the most customer-obsessed, customer-centric company in the world. And we do that, and it drives a lot of the innovation in our company as well. So one of the methods that we have in our mechanisms is the working backwards methodology that we have. And I'll dive a little deep and go off what Cheyenne had said earlier. So we have a press release. So anyone in the company that has an idea can create this document. You don't have to have 10 years of experience. You could have just been here for about a year or so. So you write this document about this idea that you have and pretend that it's being published, let's say, on the Wall Street Journal. What this would look like when it was released. So we write about a product or a service, what it would look like, how much it would cost, what pain point it's solving. Maybe we'll have quotes from a customer saying, hey, this was a great product, it helped me do X, Y, and Z. So we do this, and then we gather our stakeholders internally together in one room to do a document reading. And we'll read this document for about 20, 30 minutes together in silence, it's printed out, and we'll discuss it, we'll debate it. And your document should invoke some kind of emotion, because you're trying to solve this challenge. If it doesn't invoke anything, then maybe you're not really solving any type of pain point. So there'll be a lot of questions that come about through that, and we do the process called an FAQ. Basically, we put ourselves in the customer's shoes and see what questions that they may have. What color is it? Is it available in South Africa? Do you have kids' version of this product? And then when we have buy-in from all the stakeholders, and it could be buy-in that you may need budgets to do this, you may need headcount to do this, or you just need marketing's bandwidth to push this product out. When you get everybody's buy-in, you start working on the primitives or MVPs. So for example, in the case of AWS, the EC2 API was a primitive for our EC2 compute services. Our S3 API is a primitive for our S3 storage services. And what's important after this as well is to launch it and to iterate and to do it fast and to do it often. Iteration is very crucial here, and so is the rate of experimentation. And Jeff has something to say about that as well.
But successful invention, if you want to do a lot of that, you basically have to increase your rate of experimentation. And that you can think of as a process. How do you go about organizing your systems, your people, all of your assets, your own daily life and how you spend time. How do you organize those things to increase your rate of experimentation?
So if you think of rate of experimentation, it's about how many trials you run and test in production. So at Amazon, we do this fairly fast. So this is data I can share. It's old, but it's what I can share right now. It's May. 1 month in May, we pushed out code every 11.6 seconds. Some companies, it may take 3 months or 6 months to push an update, but we did it every 11.6 seconds back in May 2011. And we did this to about 10,000 instances or maybe 30,000 instances at once. So this basically illustrates how we can do this because of our culture, because of our leadership principles, because of who we hire, the way we're organized in 2 pizza teams, the way we dive very deep in data and are customer obsessed. So in conclusion, we talked about a lot of other companies. We talked about Amazon. We talked about Airbnb and their 10-person team and how they are organized with host team and guest teams. We talked about Spotify and their squads and how they look at alignment and autonomy, and how Supercell celebrates failures with their staff. What is it that you should think about? So you should think about your cultures, your values, who you are as a founder, what behavior that you want to exude, what values that you have as well. And when you're growing and scaling your company beyond the 2-4 people that you have as well, what are some of the mechanisms and organization structure that you want to put in place in order for you to drive that innovation into your company?